All right, great. Okay, so for the sake of the recording, I'll go ahead and say this is LGBTQ 101. What do health professionals need to know? My name is Heather Johnson. I am a lawyer and I am a doctoral candidate in a dual degree doctoral program in higher education and higher education policy. My specialty is the intersection of education policy and law. I went to the University of Chicago for undergraduate work, graduate school at the University of London, and at the Michigan State University College of Law, and at the Michigan State University College of Education. I am delighted to be asked back to Pueblo, Colorado, my hometown, where I grew up and graduated from Centennial High School, to talk to all of you today about the topic that's near and dear to my heart. And so I think that's the formal introduction. Is it okay to proceed, or should we just go ahead and get started?
Okay, get started.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen for the slides that I've presented today. Can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I think, in thinking about this, so I give these conversations a lot. I'm often asked to provide this kind of background information. And I think in the last, say, 20 to 25 years, the awareness, or the social awareness, has really been on an upward trajectory. When I lived in Colorado, I could never have imagined that the governor of the state of Colorado would be an out gay man. And so there's some things that have really evolved or changed. And recently, with some of the new Supreme Court legislation, it's clear, and Supreme Court decisions, I should say, and legislation, that trajectory is increasing. And so as more LGBTQ people are visible, or that you may know or may be, in fact, a member of this community, the way that we talk about it with others and the way that we talk about it in professional spaces is also changing. So that's really kind of the point of the conversation today. So moving on, we want to have some group agreements, because I think we are exploring, and everybody might be on a different path. Some of you may be experts in this area, and some of you may be taking on a lot of new information today. And so for the group agreements, we're going to go over in a minute a little bit about what this learning experience will be for today. I'm going to introduce the learning outcomes, but specifically for today, we're going to do an overview of LGBTQ terms, why this matters. We're going to have a little mini lesson on the dimensions of gender and sexuality, because often they are confused. And then we're going to talk about how to best create safe spaces and conversations, how you can be a good ally, and what it looks like to do inclusive policy review. So if you're working in a hospital or an institution or a clinic or any professional environment, what does it mean to have inclusive policies? And while this is, for this topic, specifically aimed at gender and sexuality, it's really good information for all of the areas of civil rights, whether it's race or alien status, or immigration status, or disability ability status. And so what I like to confirm, like thinking about like the equal employment or the civil rights categories, right? So when we talk about inclusive policy, it would be for everything under that broad umbrella of diversity. So thinking about group agreements, it's really important to me that all of you ask questions. If there's anything at any time that you have a question about, raise your hand if you're on Zoom, or raise your hand and get my attention if you're in the classroom. I can see some of them, the heads and the movements there. You might need to stop me. I'm happy to have that conversation or to answer your questions. I think it's really important. I play by Vegas rules, right? So what happens in LGBTQ 101 stays in LGBTQ 101. What I like to say is that stories stay. So if someone shares a personal story or personal information, that it stays within this group, but that the lessons that we learn from today leave with us, okay? Because I really want to make sure that we create a place where everyone feels open to sharing. The next thing is really to laugh. If something's funny, something strikes you, I hope this will be entertaining and engaging. And so the goal is really to don't be afraid to let loose. I also think we're going to be talking about some pretty sensitive topics. So there's always bound to be some giggles or some nervous laughter, and all of those things are okay. And I just want to make sure everybody knows they have the right to change their mind and to talk from their own heart and from their own space. So is there anybody have any questions so far before we turn and hop into kind of the learning objectives and the content for today. Let's do a quick check-in. Can I get a thumbs up? Everybody's cool. We're good to proceed. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. So what I'd love to do is if we could do, if you could turn to your partner, and if you're online, if you could type it into the chat. So turn to someone that's next to you, share a little bit of name, share your name and your role, or kind of like what you're here today to do. Those of you online, go ahead and put it in the chat. Talk to me something you're looking forward to this month, or any question that you might have about LGBTQIA+. Okay, so I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. It's 3:05, so let's take about 2 minutes to about 3:07 to do this, and then I'll check back in.
Since we got 5, you want to just do this as like a table deal? I'm Mitch, community health worker from Colorado Springs, working kind of in the like Park County area. Not too many questions right now. I guess I don't know. And then something I'm looking forward to is figuring out how much longer getting out of there.
I'm Patrick. I'm also a community health worker, working mainly in Woodland Park. I'm in Colorado Springs. And I'd say this summer, I'm moving back to North Carolina, so I'm excited to find a house.
Are you also going to?
That's what I'm doing.
My name is Carlos. I volunteered to be one thing I'm excited for is graduating this year.
That's really exciting.
Yeah, final year of high school.
Whereabouts are you working?
Most of the same thing.
I don't know. Contact all 16 counties.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah.
Okay, I think our time is almost up. So what I'd love is I got a few lovely things in the chat. So I understand it's your spring break week. So happy spring break, if that's true for all of you. I'm even more honored that you're here to listen to the presentation today. And I hope that you're enjoying the weather. It's not so lovely in the state that I'm in right now in Michigan. It's very cloudy, overcast day. So I hope there's some good Colorado sunshine for you all there. Do you have any questions? Like, I don't know if there's each table wants to report, or did anybody have a specific question, or is it just that you're looking for more general information?
I think we're all good here, Heather.
Okay, great. So just some more general information. Okay, great. All right. So as we think about moving forward, so the learning outcomes for today is really just to have this increased awareness around LGBTQIA vocabulary, how to use inclusive language, to understand why we want to do this, and an awareness of how to be an ally. What I want to do right now is just get a quick snapshot or background of where you all feel that you're at. So if we could hold up our hand, I think this is the best way over Zoom that I've learned to do this. So I want you to rate yourself on 1 to 5. So if it's 1, you just put a thumb or a number 1. If you think you're about a 2 out of 5 in terms of your general awareness, give yourself a 2. If you think you got this down, you're an expert, give me a 5. So hold up a hand and tell me where you are in terms of where your comfortable or comfort level is in terms of using LGBTQ language. Okay. Be honest, it's okay. Yeah, 0, I see a fist. That's cool. We got the whole range here. Okay. All right. So we got a nice range of people. Okay. How about the people online? Alexis, I see you up there. Did you hold up a number? A 2? Okay. All right. Well, that's good to know. All right. Well, hopefully we can increase that vocabulary. Thank you very much. That's really helpful for me as the presenter to get a sense of you as the group. So this might be overview for some of you that held up those 4s and those 5s. This is generally referred to as the LGBTQIA umbrella, right? And when we talk about LGBTQ, it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or transgender. I use trans with the asterisk because I want to make sure that people know that it stands for transgender or transsexual, although right now it is more commonly referred to as transgender, but it can refer to both. Q for queer or questioning, I for intersex, and A for asexual. The plus is because there are actually so many other letters that we could add that we're going to learn to or about today. But just in general, the term queer, which for some older LGBTQ members, community members, might be seen as derogatory, but starting in about the 90s, it was reclaimed as a term, as the general name to kind of refer to this entire group of people. So for the queer umbrella, we have both sexualities and genders. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, intersex are all sexualities, and genders are transgender, queer, questioning, genderqueer, or agender. And we're going to talk a little bit more about each one of those things. But I think it's really important to get the basics down, that there's 2 different things going on here. And sometimes we, especially in things like newspaper or media publications, they often confuse sex and gender one for the other. And they're similar and they're connected, but they are not, in fact, the same thing. So that has historically caused a lot of confusion. So what I'd love to do now is you all should have a glossary of terms, and it was shared out to you. For those of you in the chat, if you give me just 1 second, I want to get the group started, and then I'll share out a link for you so that you can have a copy of the glossary as well. So this is a real exercise that's difficult. A lot of groups mess this up, but I have faith in all of you. If you grab that glossary, what I want to do is read the bold-faced words only. So it's an exercise in patience to not read the definitions. Some of you could start at the end, some of you can start at the beginning, but I want you to read the bold-faced words and circle or underline or put an asterisk by the words that you're not familiar with without reading the definitions, okay? So if all of you that have that glossary of terms could start that. So again, read only the bold-faced words and asterisk or star highlight them if you don't know them. And we're gonna come back to that in just a minute. For those of you online, do you have access to the link, or do you need me? You do need me to send it, correct? Okay.
Yes, I need the link.
Great, thank you so much. Let me go grab that. Okay, so I've shared the link in the chat for everyone that's online, and you're just going to look for it says LGBTQ plus vocabulary and glossary. That's the document you're going to start with now. Okay, great. So we'll take about 3 minutes to do this. Quick show of hands, how many of you have at least one term that you've circled or highlighted? Everybody? Okay, we're gonna take about 1 more minute and then we'll come back as a group, okay? Okay. All right. So obviously there's a lot of terms out there, and this is just my version of the glossary, right? And so as an academic that I teach law and gender at MSU College of Law, so at Michigan State, and this is about the time in the class that students are just like, oh, I had no idea. Even members of the queer community are like, wow, there's some terms on here I didn't know. So what I'm looking for is a volunteer. Anybody want to tell us one of the words that they circled that they had never heard of before or that they don't know the definition of? Who would like to share? Okay, Alexis? Oh, you could unmute. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was trying to navigate back to the main screen, but bear and constellation and bender. Well, you said one, but
No, it's okay. So, well, let's go with constellation. So, okay. So you want to read us the definition? What does constellation say?
let me go back. Yes, so constellation, a way to describe the arrangement or structure of a polyamorous relationship.
Right. And so a patient may come into the clinic and say that they're polyamorous in a constellation with 6 other people, with 3 other people. And that way you would know that they have, and maybe they'll say my primary relationship is with an ex, right? With a certain person, but that I have a constellation of other relationships. So that may be a way that they talk with you about their sexual history. Does anybody else have another term that was unfamiliar? Don't be shy. Yeah, go ahead.
I have one on the first page that was just ag/aggressive, which is a word that I've heard before, but not necessarily in this context.
Sure. Right, like we know what it means to be aggressive, of course. So would you read us the definition?
Yeah, a Black or Latina lesbian with a very masculine gender presentation, often being read as boys or men, but usually not identifying as male.
Exactly. And so a lot of times, I don't know if you guys remember, it's a little bit dated, but Queen Latifah back in the day was in this movie called Set It Off. And she was like the kind of like what I'll call the quintessential version of this in that movie. She played an aggressive Black lesbian. And so that's like when I hear this definition or this description, that's what I think of. But you're looking at somebody who, you know, on quick glance, you'd probably mistake as male. They're definitely masculine of center, butch identifying. They could either be trans identified or a lesbian, a lesbian identified. And they're known for that masculine presentation. And so they may describe themselves that way, or their partners may describe them that way. Okay. Anybody else? We're going to go around. So I'm inviting everyone to share. So who wants to be next?
Both of the demis, both demi-romantic and demisexual, I had not heard of before.
Okay, go ahead and read the definition for everybody.
Demi-romantic was little or no capacity to experience romantic attraction until a strong sexual connection is formed with someone, often within a sexual relationship. And demisexual was little or no capacity to experience sexual attraction until a strong romantic connection is formed with someone, often within a romantic relationship.
Right. And so I think it's really funny, right? How we think about these things, like these are not foreign concepts, but these terms, or maybe the use of these terms, might be new to some of us. So I had a young man in a college class when I did this I did this for a group of nursing students at the University of Michigan, Flint, about 2 months ago. And he's like, oh, so this is like, you know, This one I just think about as like traditional female role or male role. So when we think about men, men don't really form an attachment until they've slept with you, but a woman, they don't really form an attachment until they fall in love with you and then they can sleep with you. And I was like, wow, that's a really interesting way, right? To like boil down what I would call the Hollywood romanticization of relationships. Now, I don't know that that's true, but I think it helped certainly that young person think about it. And so now, right, we're starting to be able to name or to identify. I certainly know young men who are demisexual or who are demi-romantic, and young women that would identify in both of these ways. So I'm sorry, I heard a little bit of noise. Was it a question or was someone raising their hand? We're all good? Okay. So yeah, I think those are great terms to bring up. And I also think it helps us think through maybe the one-dimensional way that we think about gender and sexuality. Heteronormativity is a word, right? So it's like, we all know what like it means to be, like we think about heterosexual. So whether you are straight and attracted to traditional or conventional normed behaviors. So if you're a man, you'd be a masculine identified and attracted to female, or vice versa if you're female and attracted to a male. When we think about heteronormative, right, this is the concept that we automatically assume that someone is going to conform to those gender roles, or an individual is going to conform to the expectations of heterosexual relationships. So that's like an argument for even gay people who feel that they don't want to get married because they don't want to conform to a heterosexual norm, right? So this concept of heteronormativity. So I think terms like demi-romantic and demisexual allow space for people to describe how they're feeling or what they're feeling, regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. Straight individuals could use these terms to identify how they think about intimate sexual relationships or emotional relationships. Okay. Anybody else? Who else hasn't shared that has a term that caught their eye? Okay, yeah, back in.
I didn't know the term, is it gap or goth or?
I'm sorry, speak up just a little bit. I'm having trouble hearing you. I want to make sure I got the right one.
I didn't know the term gap.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead and read the definition.
A device used to conceal a genetic male's penis to that no bulge is visible.
Mm-hmm. Right. So who might use one of these?
Trans women.
A trans person, sure. But who else?
Drag queen.
You got it. You got it. RuPaul made him famous, right? Okay. And so pretty common device used basically to slim. Does anybody know what somebody, Alexis actually mentioned it, binder, right? So a binder would be the equivalent for androgynous, trans, or butch female that wanted to slim or hide the appearance of their breasts, right? And binding is something we run into a lot in the health professions, especially for young individuals who do not come from supportive environments. They tend to bind with things that they shouldn't and get in trouble. So there are binders that are made that are of compression material, just like we would use for like compression socks, that are really recommended or that are medically advised, right? People bind, they get desperate when they want to conform to their gender identity. So they'll bind with things like duct tape or ace bandages, and that can actually impact their lungs, their breathing, their bone structure, and can cause some very serious medical problems over time. And so it's really important to understand what these devices are and how they can be used. Because if you see a young man, a young trans man who wants to hide the appearance of his genitals, you hope he's not using duct tape. You hope he's using a proper tool or a proper gaff. And the same for a young female who would like to, maybe is transitioning from female to male and does not want to have the appearance of a chest. And so it's really important to understand how to talk about it, and to not only that, but to know that there are proper medically approved devices out there for the young members of this population. Kind of get them the best information. Anybody else? Who else has a term or an item to think about? Somebody from that back table. Who?
Oh, so I have not been familiar with the lipstick lesbian term.
Okay, great. Read the definition for us.
Usually refers to a lesbian with a feminine gender expression, can be used in a positive or a derogatory way. Sometimes also used to refer to a lesbian who is assumed to be or passes for straight.
Okay. So can you give me an example of anybody that might be referred to as a lipstick lesbian? Like, am I a lipstick lesbian? No, right. No. Okay. Who would be? So like probably one of the most famous ones I know is maybe Portia de Rossi, Ellen's wife, right? So glamorous, ball gowns, always on a red carpet. She would be the quintessential lipstick lesbian. Okay. Who else? Anybody have another? Like, we call them L-word lesbians too, right? So it's like the Hollywood version of lesbian. It's absolutely for the male gaze. There's these super feminine women that always have perfect hair and perfect makeup, but they like other women, but the men like to look at them, right? And so that's typically a lipstick lesbian. It's just something to know for how people refer to others. Okay. Anybody else? One more. Who hasn't shared yet?
I guess I can say that I have not heard the word stone
Okay.
be utilized. So it says a person who may or may not desire sexual contact with the genitals or breast, often used stone butch or stone femme.
Okay. Yeah. Great pickup. So, and thanks for sharing the definition. So this is a phenomena that happens mostly in the lesbian population, but it also can happen in for trans women. And so typically it's someone who does not enjoy sexual contact. It may also be a term that's used or favored by someone that identifies as asexual, that doesn't have any interest in any sexual intimacy or sexual contact with others. And so a very famous butch woman named Leslie Feinberg wrote a book called The Stone Butch Blues, and it's been out for about a decade. And it really talks about with their struggles and like, having a relationship and intimate partners and really kind of expressing who they are and their gender and their sexuality. And so I think it's just, again, it's an interesting piece to know that not only people are out there, but when they come in, their sexual history may be very limited because they don't want to experience that. I think alternatively, in the health professions, what would happen if someone is asexual or if someone identifies themselves as stone, if they were in some kind of situation of sexual exploitation or sexual harassment, I think there'd be additional things to talk about or additional things to maybe think from a trauma perspective about that experience than we would in other ways. Right. And so I think it's all important to know as a healthcare provider, as a social worker, as someone that might be treating an individual in terms of the nuances of their identification, even if it's just that you listen and that you recognize that they are who they are, that you're not shocked, that you don't treat them any differently, that maybe you ask a follow-up question about what that means to them. They will feel seen and feel supported while seeking that medical attention, which is really important. And so I think for this is just the vocabulary exercise. Obviously now you all have a copy. This list is growing and changing. Just so you know, there's 153 different gender identities at the moment. That list is ever evolving and growing. Part of it is because we just didn't have the language. Like, the term lesbian wasn't actually added to the dictionary until the 1920s. right? So I think the way that we think about it and the language that we use to describe sexuality, gender, attraction, emotional relationships, intimacy, sexual intimacy is growing and evolving very rapidly. And it's important, I think, for us to, from time to time, check in and make sure that we keep up with some of this evolution. So I invite you to keep a copy of this glossary handy. If you encounter a new word, you can certainly send me a note or add it to the list. But hopefully it'll help you think a little bit about it. And if anybody has any questions, or if you get to reading it and you want to discuss something more in depth, I'm happy to have you bring it up either later today or after the session has concluded. Because I just think it's important as a think piece for us to all have that baseline information of what the words are that you may hear coming from the LGBTQ community. Does anybody have any questions before we move on from this part of the conversation? Okay. So I want to do a quick reflection. So we've kind of gotten into some glossary of terms. I want you to turn to your table or to the person sitting next to you. And if you're online, you can think about it for a minute and go ahead and put it in the chat. I want you to answer the following 3 questions. I want you to ask when the first time you heard someone call another person gay or fag or dyke in a derogatory way, like how old were you? The second is, what's the earliest memory of an LGBTQ person that you have? Specifically, when do you remember knowing they exist? And then the third, of course, is who was the first LGBTQIA person you knew? So we're going to take about 3 to 5 minutes. So turn to, again, your partners. If you want to do it as a table, you can. But just take a minute to reflect and share that with your group. Okay, those of you online, go ahead and put that in the chat if you're so inclined. Okay.
So the first person that you do to ask a question.
I think for me, the first time I heard somebody use those words in a derogatory way was probably like the start of middle school. I agree. Kids had, I guess, a little bit more freedom and kind of their social circles and whatnot, so they did with that what they did. Earliest memory of an LGBT person, I would say is also probably middle school, but probably a little bit later in middle school. Yeah. I feel like they kind of came out and started to portray themselves as such. We were definitely throwing those words around in middle school.
But generations. Yeah. I lost him to the kids. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it was more of like, we knew we weren't really supposed to say, or at least use those words in the way that they were being used, which, I mean, I feel like as younger kids, all more reasons like that. Yeah, and your mental process. Yeah, we definitely really didn't talk about it in class or anything like that. We had to figure it out on your own type situation.
That's what's like, it's so interesting. Like, so it's never.
Did everybody order my email?
Like, I don't know, I know like.
Right.
I know our experience.
This is hard to like notice until you know what it is.
It was a really big event. I had this brand tiny baby. That was
Yeah. Didn't know. Like, we didn't know how.
My nephew is award-winning, beautiful bridal sheets. So Joe is on the line.
Okay. So I think everybody's had a chance to kind of get through the list. I would love to kind of hear in some of the answers that you shared with each other. So I'd like a volunteer for each answer. So when was the first time you heard someone call another person gay, fag, or dyke in a derogatory way? Yeah, back in the room.
School. I think the kids on the playground always, especially boys, would call each other, vague or something like that.
Okay, so like elementary, middle school?
Elementary. I don't
Okay.
really.
And it was a bad thing, right? It was like the thing you didn't want to be, right? Okay. Yeah, for me, I was the tomboy growing up. I was always into football. And every day at recess in the 5th grade, we would play Smear the Queer, right? So like you throw the ball, everybody catches it. The thing you did was you beat the crap out of whoever caught the ball because they were the queer. So I had no idea what that word meant, but I knew I did not want to be it, right? That was for sure, right? Okay. What's your earliest memory? Anybody else want to share earliest memory of an LGBTQ person?
I'll share. I come from a different generation than Shanae, so I don't think I really heard, and I'm probably the oldest person in the room, so I don't think I actually, I was probably familiar, but I'd never heard the word until I was in high school.
Okay.
So that's a totally different generation.
No, but I think here's the thing. At the end of this slide, the point that I usually make is let's think about how this impacts generational differences, right? Because when I think about my mom says the same thing, right? She says, oh man, I didn't know this was like a thing, like that you could be gay or queer or lesbian until high school. And the first time I ever met someone that was or that identified in that way, I was a professional. It was well into my professional career. She thinks she was like 25 or 26. That's a much different perspective with I knew my best friend came out to me in middle school, which is what's happening right now, right? With students today. And so we can think about those generational differences and what impact that may have on comfortability with this language, on whether they think that it's real or that LGBTQ variance happens, or just the familiarity with the diversity within the queer community. So that's a really important point. Thank you. Thank you for making it. What about the third one? When was the first person that would, I think the last question or the last comment really kind of says, kind of shows us this difference. But for all of you, how old were you? Were you 5? Were you 10? Were you in high school?
I think for myself, I was probably about 7, 8, 9, and it was through MTV, and I had a lot of questions. But I think that's my first kind of, my first kind of like, well, this person is definitely a lot different than, people that you see on TV or know.
Was there a particular queer person? Or
oh
was
yeah,
it...
Boy George.
Oh, I love it. Yes. Nice. Yeah. So we must be about the same age then, is what I'm going to say. Yeah. For me, it was Boy George and Annie Lennox. So they were Eurythmics. Do you remember? She had orange hair and she wore the skinny tie and the suit. Like those were the queer icons. And in fact, what's wild is Boy George and Annie Lennox were the first musicians and first artists ever featured on Newsweek magazine. And it was like the alt pop queer is here kind of thing. And it was in 1988. And that was like mind blowing, right? The first time in print media, because this is before the internet, right?
Oh yeah.
So the way that you consumed information was really television or print materials. And so if I think about how images proliferate now, like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, like we can snap somebody that we see on the street that's different from we are, and it can go viral, right? In a minute. But that wasn't the way it happened. And so when we think about who the icons were or who we knew, it was usually artists or musicians. Like Prince, everybody's like, wow, this guy's really sexual. Is he queer? Where is he at on the spectrum, right? Or you have like Katie Lang, right? This country crooner who's this total butch lesbian, okay? And so you have this whole vast spectrum of icons, but that's probably the one person you knew. Like a lot of people 10 years ago, when they said, do you know a gay person? They said, yeah, I know Ellen, right? Like that was the reference for a gay person, okay? So what difference or what impact may this have on how people you would see in clinic or that you come into contact with may feel about coming out to you or disclosing information until they know if you're a trusted source? What do people think?
Well, I have a little story that maybe I can share. I was in my 30s. I'm a nurse and I worked at a hospital. I worked in a forensic setting.
Mhm.
And so I worked with a lot of male employees. And one of the male employees was gay. He was open about it. And it became confusing to me because I felt like I was very close to him. I really cared a lot about him. But he would come to work and often share a lot of his romantic stories with me. So I felt like I had to draw a line for him. And I drew the line for myself, thinking, I don't come to work and share my romance with my husband to other individuals. So I think the information he's giving to me is very personal. And I told him I didn't need to know all about his romances. And he took offense to that. And so it created a lot of tension between us, but it does get sensitive and it becomes confusing. And so you have to figure out where your boundaries are on a variety of issues and how you interact and how you continue to be sensitive to those around you that you care about.
Sure. It sounds like this is a case of what I'd call the overshare, right? And so it's like if a person that was your, a girlfriend that was in a straight romantic relationship came to work and shared the same details, you probably would have drawn the same boundary, right? Because it made you uncomfortable in terms of the depth of what was being shared. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely.
Okay. Right. And so I think that's an important point to make is like, we all have different informational boundaries. I'm talking about those specifically, I think, in a clinical setting, when you're interviewing a patient about, for medical history, or you're working with someone, often as a lesbian, when I am in a clinical setting, people will ask, the number one thing they want to know is there any way you could be pregnant? And I say no. And they say, well, we have to do a urine test anyway. And that's pretty funny to me, right? Okay. The other thing they often ask it, I can't even tell you how many safe sex lectures I've had about the need to use a condom. And I'm like, this really doesn't apply to me, right? And so I think it's really important to think about what information we need to share and how do we be respectful of those patients. I'm almost never asked, and I mean, I think a lot of men are never asked, and it's just assumed that they're straight, especially if they're straight presenting. And so there's a lot of, or sometimes people don't identify as gay or lesbian, and then we miss things. So as a lesbian, you're more inclined to have a higher body mass index. You're more inclined to have respiratory and heart failure. You're more inclined to not seek medical advice because you feel you're being discriminated. So by the time you go get, you are more advanced in whatever it is that you have. We know for men, some men do not identify as being gay, and yet they have sexual intercourse with other men. So we need to think about them in terms of increased infectious disease protocols, or thinking about their exposure to things like HIV. And when we don't have the right questions, or we don't have the right vocabulary, it's hard to notice, or we might miss some of that really important information. And so it sounds like the description or the event, the little vignette that you were sharing, that's a little bit different. That's about how to work with a gay colleague in the workplace, which is really kind of what would apply to any colleague that was sharing too much information. That's not because they were gay. I mean, maybe they felt that they could share with you because you were in a medical profession. But again, I think that was more about the type of depth of information that was being shared rather than who was sharing that information. Okay. Anybody have any other thoughts or questions? A lot of times I see this come into play in a classroom, in a medical environment, dealing with social workers, dealing with teachers, when a young child may have an issue or a concern and a parent doesn't want to deal with that issue or concern because maybe they're of a different generation and they have a bias, or they don't want to believe that their child is queer and might want to be on hormones, that that they may need medical attention for something that is related to being a member of the queer community if they're a minor under the age of 18. And so that generational gap, the familiarity with the queer community, with queer information becomes really important, especially when they're making those medical decisions for the child. So I'd like to just make sure that we bring up and talk a little bit about all of the dimensions that can impact someone coming out to you, someone disclosing that private information. So there's mental health concerns as well as just physical health concerns, right? Any other thoughts or questions before we move on? Just a quick check. Okay. So why does this matter? This awareness matter? We've been talking a little bit about it. Does anybody want to offer, put it into their own words?
I do know that the LGBTQ plus community faces like health disparities, mainly because of bias within healthcare providers. So making sure they're taken care of as much as the heterosexual community is just as important.
Absolutely. Great answer. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we can that's perfect summary and a kind of a great transition to the next set of slides. Can I just give a little bit of statistics about, kind of background and the public health information that we have to put this in the proper context? So according to the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, there's an 86% increase as of 2017 in the homicide rate of LGBTQ persons from the previous year, 71% of those being LGBTQ homicides of transgender women of color. So we have some, interesting things happening as usual at this intersection of race and sex and gender. When we think a little bit about suicide risk, we can also talk about it, but this is specifically looking at homicides. So in terms of being the target of a violent crime. So when you see a trans person in a healthcare setting, you know that they've probably encountered that level of hate or bias just by simply existing. There's a higher rate of suicidality among the lesbian, gay, and bisexual population, according to the CDC. LGBT youth, so they're separated out from trans use because those rates are higher, and we'll discuss them in just one moment. But LGBT youth seriously contemplate suicide 3 times the rate of heterosexual youth. And they're 5 times as likely to attempt suicide. So if you are presented with an LGBTQ individual, I would just say LGBT individual or someone that's questioning, know that suicide rate or that suicidality factor is much higher or much greater. When we think about suicidality in trans individuals, the National Trans Discrimination Survey says that nearly half of all transgender adults have reported making a suicide attempt because of that societal pressure and the not being accepted. 60%, and this is a statistic that all of us need to take to heart, of respondents who had experienced discrimination by a medical or mental health professional had attempted suicide. And 92%, of those individuals reported attempting suicide by the age of 25. And so for me, as a person who primarily teaches in higher ed, in college campuses or with graduate students in law schools and nursing and social work programs, that means that if I encounter a trans person, it's a high likelihood, 92% chance that they have probably attempted suicide because of the bias and the discrimination that they have felt. What do we know? If you've attempted suicide, that you probably feel pretty alienated, you have depression or anxiety or some other similar mental health disorder, You may not have the support that you need at home, and that may have other long-term health outcomes or health impacts. So I think we need to take mental health seriously with the LGBTQ community. And a quick aside is right now, as you know, I'm sure because you can turn on a newspaper, turn on the news or read a newspaper or read a blog or look at social media, trans issues, whether it's a trans sports ban, whether it's anti-gay legislation, whether it's not allowing transgender youth to have proper health care, is a huge voting issue in the next election cycle. And so this hatred or this amount of proliferation of information in the news media is adversely impacting trans health. So the Trevor Project reports 250% increase among trans individuals' rate of suicidality in the last year and a half. So first of all, these statistics, as we can see, are from 2016. We know that those numbers have gone up because of the pandemic, because of isolation, because of being at home, because people didn't have normal social communities. And then on top of that, because of this ratcheted up environment of political speech and debate in the ether, that's gone up to a 250% increase from these statistics. So there's a real trans health crisis or mental health crisis for members of the queer community right now because of this stress and this pressure. The other thing I want to kind of take a moment, so the Williams Institute is a premier institute located at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA School of Law. They do a ton of studies. In fact, Ilian Meyer, who is one of the chief sociologists there and mental health workers, is really looked into a lot of the public health implications for LGBT. In fact, he models his research off of a lot of the research that was done in the Black and the Latina community in the 70s when we think about minority stress. So if you're familiar with minority stress theory and the implications in public health, you can see the direct line to the LGBTQ community in terms of the minority stress that you may face from being a sexual orientation or gender identity minority. I wanted to take a little quick minute to think about the juvenile justice system and the intersection there, because we think a lot about who ends up in the prison system, who is truant, who has a health problem, who has attempted suicide, and they've kind of collected this information. And so we see that LGBTQ youth are held in custody longer, over their straight counterparts. We see that sexual minority girls are disproportionately incarcerated, and that they're also at risk for being victimized by their peers. And so when a person doesn't conform, right, with their gender or gender identity or their gender presentation, they're more likely to be targeted by the criminal justice system, and that increases for women who are outside of the norm. We think about the factors that lead to juvenile justice involvement. These are true for other indicators as well, but when we think about LGBTQ youth specifically, we look at this family rejection, this harassment in prior placements, harassment in schools, isolation and depression and low self-esteem, and then just general homophobia and the lack of people understanding them, and how it can lead to any of these other what we call pathways into the juvenile justice system, whether it's poor attendance or they fight back, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's that they get enrolled in alternative programs because they drop out. And so you see a lot of the same, what I'll call systemic factors that affect other groups that are often targeted or alienated based on race or ability or socioeconomic status to also be true for the LGBTQ community. Interestingly, if you think about the statistics, the single biggest factor is this accepting versus non-accepting parents. And so when you think about parents who have rejected, so the darker green here is parents that have rejected their child for being LGBTQ, you see an 8.4% to 1 increase for attempted suicide, a 5.9% increase for depression, a 3.1% increase for illegal drug use. And the likelihood that they'll have riskier unprotected sex is also increased by 3.4 to 1. Those are huge percentages, huge impacts over their straight peers, simply because the parents don't accept or don't try to relate to them in terms of that rejection. And so obviously, huge health disparities, huge health impacts. If you're dealing with LGBT youth, they may have a criminal record or may have a criminal background. This may have adversely affected them in other ways. So I think it's just something to think about. I think we want to be concerned about that unprotected sex. We want to give them health resources. We want to talk about safe sex materials. We want to make sure we hit illegal drug use. We want to make sure that we screen them for depression and anxiety and get them the mental health resources they need if possible. And we want to take seriously any indication of suicidality. This is a summary slide for the youth in custody that we just talked about, so I'm going to go ahead and skip it. And so we're going to kind of turn a little bit to what we need to know a little bit more about sex and gender. I'm going to go through these slides quite quickly because they're kind of a recap of what we've been talking about thus far. So we think about sex and gender on this kind of continuum, right? Like on this slider. And so we talk about the binary being male on one end and female on the other. So that's like binary. Think about a coin, like it's heads or tails, right? But we know that human sexuality is not binary, in fact, and it's really a default, right? We walk into a family gathering, maybe for, a football game or a graduation, and the first thing that your aunt or your grandma wants to know is, who are you dating, or when are you going to have children, right? So we've heteronormed every interaction, right, on this binary. And so you're asked a question according to, whether you're male or whether you're female. But we know that there is a large swath of individuals in the middle. So sex versus gender. Sex is what you are assigned at birth. It's based on hormones, genitalia, secondary sex characteristics. You can be intersex. Interestingly, an outdated term you'll often hear is hermaphrodite. Please don't use it, but you might see it in some older medical journals. It's kind of a no-go. Approximately 1 in 2,000 babies have both female and male anatomical characteristics. How many of you know a redhead? Do you guys know somebody that has red hair? Okay, so redheads are about the same prevalence in society as intersex people, right? Does that blow your mind? Like, think about that for a minute. So if you know someone that has red hair, it's the same statistical possibility that you also know someone that's intersex, but you just don't know because maybe they didn't give you the, they don't know. They don't know because they haven't had the chromosome tests, or they don't know because they have normal secondary sex characteristics, or maybe they think they're normal, right? Okay, but that's the reality. Like, that's how prevalent being intersex is in society. And so it's something we just perhaps don't know. There is a video here. I'm going to leave it in the, we'll have, if we have time to watch it at the end. Actually, how are we doing on time? Do we have about maybe 15, 20 minutes left?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, so this is about a 10-minute video, and I'd love to have you watch it. It's about hearing about intersex people from actual intersex people. And so I'm going to go ahead and see if I can stop sharing, and then I'll present it. Okay. Okay, can you all see this? All right.
Raise your hands if you have testes. I'm Pigeon. I'm Alice. I'm Emily.
I'm Cypher.
And we are intersexy.
Intersex describes a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of male or female.
I have XY chromosomes, but typical female genitalia.
I'm a girl who has testes and XY chromosomes.
I identify as a queer, gender non-conforming intersex person.
I identify as a Black intersex man.
Intersex is not new. It's been around since the beginning of human existence. I mean, there's probably even intersex dinosaurs, if you think about it.
Transgender has to deal with your gender identity, whereas intersex has to deal with your biological characteristics.
Often, intersex people get surgeries that they don't want, and transgender people have to fight for surgeries that they do want. They gave my mom the excuse that the internal testes were cancerous, that I would develop cancer.
They didn't even come up with an excuse, basically, in terms of a health-related reason. They instead just said it was about the appearance.
A lot of doctors are very uncomfortable with the idea that I have testes, and they're still trying to get them removed, but I'm perfectly healthy and there's nothing wrong with them.
They did a surgery to remove my testes and told my parents to take me home and just raise me as a girl. And I didn't find out about it myself until I was 12.
There aren't a lot of options, or medical providers don't explore other options. My mom would put me in dresses and she would be like, "Oh, aren't you so cute and you're so pretty?" And I would be like, "No, this is horrible." I was put on hormonal treatment, which consisted of estrogen and progesterone. I just wanted to belong. I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be different. So even though I knew something felt amiss, I conformed. He was very condescending. He was like, "You intersex activists don't know what you're talking about."
It's difficult for intersex people to find each other because from an early age, we're told not to talk about our bodies.
I did feel like I was the only one.
My doctors always told me there was nobody else like me. And so it just perpetuates a vicious cycle of shame and stigma that we can't break out of. I would tell another intersex person that you are worthy, you are lovable.
Your body is beautiful, you're beautiful.
Intersex people don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with them.
I know you feel like you might not be able to get through this. I know you might have really dark thoughts, but I want you to know that meeting other intersex people and finding a community or a support group can be one of the most important aspects in your healing process. And we're out there, we're out here, we're here. And I just hope you can find us.
So what do people think? Oftentimes it's a new piece of information. People haven't really thought a lot about intersex individuals or even met or seen someone that is. Did that video raise any interesting points that you hadn't thought of?
Heather, as a nurse, I worked in the newborn nursery many years ago. And it's something really that even health professionals did not talk about, most likely because they did not know enough about it.
Right. Exactly, exactly. And so I think being here, attending lectures like this, maybe reading an article or doing a search and finding out, or even asking the question, what do we do? What's our hospital policy? So that when this happens, you know, and you can provide the support to that individual is really important. And so I think it's something that we are just now, I think the laws and society and general awareness are just kind of catching up to all of the different variation within sexual orientation, gender identity, and basically sex characteristics. So just offer that as food for thought, something to take away and maybe think about, as we move forward. As we think about gender, again, we have this very binary or traditional view of things where we think it's either man or woman, but gender is really how one identifies. And so in the middle, we have, somebody that's genderqueer, which is how I identify. Someone that's two-spirit or bigender or third gender are also common definitions or terms. Two-spirit, of course, is Native American individuals identify in this manner. And in fact, they were usually exalted or, thought to be shaman or had a, place of privilege in their tribes because they could understand this intersection of this male and female identity and energy. And so it's interesting how culturally different things have been ascribed to different individuals and identities. We think about gender expression, we think about dress and mannerisms and roles and identity. So of course, traditionally we have masculine or feminine gender expression, but then we have this multiple or mixed or androgynous, like we talked about Boy George, we talked about Annie Lennox earlier today. One of the more modern examples, I think, is Jaden Smith, right? He got the line for, he's now modeling, and he obviously wears skirts or dresses, or think about somebody like Dan Levy from Schitt's Creek, right? When he won the Golden Globe and the Oscar, or not Oscar, sorry, Golden Globe, right? He wore a male tuxedo that had the skirt on it. And so you have this gender expression, or these gender roles or identity that are expressed in different ways. And last but not least, we think about the difference with sexual orientation, right? So physical, emotional attractions. So whether you're attracted to men, whether you're attracted to women, or whether you're attracted to both or multiple genders. So you could be heterosexual, you could be gay, you could be lesbian, but you could also be bisexual or pansexual or multisexual or asexual. So there's all of this variation within what used to be this binary way of thinking. And so kind of as we've pushed on today, or kind of as we've thought about it, how does this, matter? Well, when we think about hospital policies, when we think about society, when we think about education, when we think about how all of the systems that we know, government, are created, it was really created for someone that was assigned male at birth, that identifies as a man, that has the gender expression of a man, that has a sexual orientation of being attracted to women. That's the baseline, the white, cis, straight man, right? But if you are female or identify as genderqueer, and maybe you're a little more feminine and you're attracted to women, you may be othered or come up against a policy or a place or an environment that you don't feel comfortable. And clearly, as you can see, all of these sliders could be adjusted for your own identity and how you feel about yourself. The thing that I'm finding is that increasingly, people that are older, people that have maybe graduated or been out 10 years or in graduate school, maybe haven't thought about where they fit on each one of these dimensions of gender and sexuality, the same way that, say, maybe a queer person has, or maybe a young person has. Right now, when I give this talk, or when I talk about it to middle schoolers or high schoolers, they're like, oh yeah, we thought about this, and I'm da-da-da-da. And they can easily identify who they are and where they're at on this slider. Alternatively, if I go in to do like continuing legal education with a bunch of people who have been lawyers for 10 years, they're like, dude, I'm a man, I'm straight. Like, I don't understand what the question is. Like, they have not thought about this, right? So I think some of it is just taking that self-inventory, taking a moment to reflect and think about, who am I? Where am I at? Because it may not be something that you have come into contact with before. So two of the other handouts that you should have, and if you're online, they are also in the handout folder. You see the genderbread person and the gender unicorn. Now, typically, if I'm working with a younger person, a child, I may ask them to think with the gender unicorn. You can see the website for this on the bottom, and the individual, the younger person may want to go online and move and actually play with the sliders to tell you how they feel, because they may not have the vocabulary or the language to do so. The genderbread person I find particularly helpful. The website here, they continually update it, but I just think it's this really helpful graphic when you're talking to people, so identity is in your brain, it's how you think, expression is how you show off to the world, like how people read you, attraction is what you feel, is who you are attracted to, right? And then sex is like what your sex is like physically, are, what is the genital, the chromosomes, right? Like that sex. What I really like about this is that we're really starting to talk about the difference of attraction in terms of sexual attraction and romantic attraction. And that's a new development that's come out in about the last 5 to 7 years. So when you all think about like a bromance, right? Like that's one that we've all heard, like, oh my gosh, they're having a bromance. So you can actually be like romantically attracted to a man, but not be sexually attracted to them if you're a man, right? Like, so you might be romantically, meaning intimately, or like, and then that deep sense of connection without any sexual relationship, right? And so I think that's kind of where this is headed, or where it's going when we think about mental health, or when we think about finding a community, is breaking down who you're attracted to in both some sexual terms and romantic terms. Hopefully that's some helpful information for you to take away. And I would invite you to do some reflection, and even to think about how you might use that to inform your language or your vocabulary as you talk to others who may be members of the queer community. This quick activity we're going to skip. This is in fact the reflection that I just asked you to do. If we had longer period, we'd be taking a break, but I want to make sure that I get into the LGBTQ public health and minority stress configurations. I mentioned this before, that this really follows the the minority stress theory of physical and mental health and sexual minority groupings. And it's basically the theory that there are serious health consequences for those that are continually othered by government, by society, by groups. So anybody that would be a minority classification. So perhaps it's a racial minority designation, it's a one based on disability. So the original public health and minority stress theory was developed around Black and Brown people in South LA. In fact, this research was really funded and looked at largely due to the Black Panther Party and to the women in the sociological roots in South LA in the 70s and the Chicano movements. And so we have all of them to thank for the minority stress theory research. So thinking about compared to heterosexual individuals, LGBT individuals exhibit all of these pieces. I'm going to just in general say, you know, higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of asthma, higher allergies. I'll make these slides available and you can easily look up the studies that I'm relating to. So if that's something that you want to look into or have further information about, it'll be present. Compared to heterosexuals, lesbians and bisexual women incur these higher risks of cancers and breast cancer and diagnosis of cardiovascular disease. There's a myriad of reasons why discussed in the medical literature, but those are the big takeaways. So just know that there are some discrepancies and disparities. So in terms of mental health, we've talked a little bit about the implications about anti-gay prejudice, increasing in health risk. We've talked about that, the kind of what could happen because of sex or gender segregation. So when we think about public restrooms or locker rooms or jails or shelters and how that might lead to minority stress, there's definitely some good research out there. And then finally, in 2016, there was a study that looked at examined sexual orientation-based disparities in mental health treatment in a longitudinal study, and it really showed that there was this increase elevated risk for poor mental health among LGBT individuals because of all of these extraneous factors, because of all of this bias. So if you're interested in that research, there's some, you know, the individuals and kind of the studies that are cited, and I'm happy to talk more about this with you afterwards. So really we kind of turn, you know, this is the end of the presentation, and we're going to summarize to think about what you can do, like as a person that's going to enter a professional world, how can you be better equipped? So I think, you know, knowing the vocabulary, being mindful of this nuance that's involved, making sure that you're really curious and that you're free of judgment. So when someone reveals something to you, know that they must trust you or they must need help and they see you in a role of helping. And so to get really curious and ask good questions to understand. If you have the opportunity to use their preferred name and pronouns or ask them what they are, that really goes a long way, particularly for the queer community, to signal that you are respectful and that you understand and that you recognize their humanity. When you can use appropriate terms, my rule of thumb is that if they use it to describe themselves, then you use it. But I don't ever use a term to describe someone until they have first used it. And sometimes I have to clarify, how would you like to be referred to? Or would you identify as X? If they haven't said that they're queer. So if they say, I sometimes sleep with men, I don't automatically label that individual as gay. I just say, okay, so you disclose that you sometimes sleep with men. Do you always have protected sex, right? That would be my follow-up. So I think it's really important to make sure that we use the same language that they're using, we give back to them. And then I think the last but not least is to make sure that we check our forms and our statements and our websites for inclusive language. So the biggest faux pas that I see is that I'll walk into an urgent care or I'll walk into a medical setting and there will be 2 boxes on the form for sex, and it's male and female. I mean, right away, I'm flagged as a queer person, that there's no other option, that we are attached to the binary and there's not even an other for me to check other and put something else in. If they don't ask about my orientation, or they don't ask about my gender identity, then I know that they may not be open to discussing, or they may not actually be well-versed in discussing what my health needs are. So I think one of the things that we need to do is to think about how are we signaling that we are inclusive and that we can handle these questions and address the medical needs of this community from something as simple as our intake process and our intake forms. We have pronouns. There's a handout that was provided to you, a little bit about how to use pronouns. I think it's been a lot in the news. It's all over. There's a couple of good YouTube videos that I can direct you to on using pronouns if there's any confusion. But I also think this is a low-hanging fruit. Just like somebody says, hey, my name is Francis, but I prefer to go by Frank, or they have a long, maybe foreign name and they go by, Ed or Betty instead of their long foreign name. Or maybe they're named after their father, but they prefer to go by their initials, right? For whatever reason, we would call them the name they prefer. So I think it's important to also recognize people's pronouns, if we can do so, to make sure that they feel that we are respecting them as an individual, particularly when they're coming to get medical treatment. And that's whether you agree or not, right? Like, I think there's something to be said for, I may not agree with what you're doing or the choices that you've made, but I recognize that you are a human being and that you deserve the medical care. And I'm here in my professional role to provide it. And so I think there's that boundary setting that we do for ourselves that's really important as professionals. I've talked a little bit about creating safe space. And I use a guideline here from U of M Flint because I thought it was one of the best and simplest. And so this is a University of Michigan. They recognize the importance of a diverse student body, staff, and faculty. So you'll often, hospitals, schools, you'll see a statement like this, where they recognize sex, gender, race, class, sexuality in their standard practice or in their guidelines. That's really telling. Like, as a queer person, I can look at that and I know that they're supposed to care about diversity and inclusion, and that's really important. So that's often a place to start if you want to make sure that an organization that you're considering working for or working with is as inclusive as they say. Is it in their standard practice guidelines? And then I think you always want to ask how the organizations that you're working in or for are committed to fostering equitable environments, and then what you can do in the roles that you are in. So I would just say next steps for all of you to think about, or what are the organizational policy guidance? Like, would you develop or revise policies? Would you think a little bit about how do you change an intake form, or how are we going to ask people what their pronouns are if they've identified in some manner with the queer community, and in practice having those inclusive conversations. And if you don't identify with the queer community, I think it's really important to think about how you can be a good ally in your professional role, so we don't increase that stigma, whether it's or in the mental and physical health implications that come from that LGBTQ bias. And so I think with that, I offer these 5 tips kind of as this takeaway, kind of thinking about like what the goal of LGBTQ 101 is to really be more, making sure that we don't perpetuate any of that type of bias in our professional roles. And I would be open to taking any questions or any other information that you're looking to have at this time.
I have a question. I've worked with an agency that only served women, children, and those who identified as trans women. However, I've seen several times where cisgender men will state that they're transgender just to receive services. Is there an appropriate way of asking someone if they are actually a transgender woman?
Just exactly what you just said. So to me, it's really easy on an intake form, right, to have people check a box, right? Because then they don't feel alienated. And it's like the whole idea is that you're asking everybody the same information and you can self-identify. Now, if it's private and it's in a one-on-one conversation, you can just say, look, I see that you've indicated that you're a member of the trans community. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Okay. Or you can just simply say, I assume that you identify as a transgender woman because you're here to receive, like in this, in the hypothetical that you've just given, can you tell me a little bit about what that means, what that looks like? Have you physically transitioned? Have you hormonally transitioned? Are you just dressing as a female? And so they could tell you a little bit about, where they're at to see if they qualify. And then I think it's important to know what your organization guidelines are. Are you treating people that have only physically or hormonally transitioned or that are interested in that service? Where are you going to draw the line, right? And so that's why I think it's important to kind of think about what the policies are.
Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Anybody else? Come on, y'all. Somebody has to have a question.
Well, while they're thinking, I just want to thank you, Heather. I'm lucky to have very smart friends and generous. And Heather, if you notice, Kendra Hawkins is logged on to our event. She's actually the GSA, Gay Straight Alliance sponsor from Centennial. And you said you wanted to donate your speaker fee to an organization in Pueblo. So I felt that it was important to get back to your school. So that's where your speaker fee is going. You donated to the sponsor at Centennial High School for their events. So,
Woohoo, go Bulldogs. Okay.
yeah.
All right. So here's the thing. I'm on Twitter. I often tweet about all things LGBTQ related. I'm at Ed Policy Law. I encourage Sinead to share my contact information. If you ever have a question or need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you so much for attending, and I wish you the best in your professional endeavors.
Thank you, Heather. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Really well done. Thank you.
Thank you.